Too many fantasy worlds get religion completely wrong in my opinion. They slap together a list of gods, assign them some cool powers, and call it world building. But that's not how real religions work, and it's why so many fantasy pantheons feel hollow if you ask me. I've been crafting fantasy worlds for over 20 years, and when I now mentor new fantasy writers, the first question I ask them about the divine aspects of their story isn't who are your gods, but why does your world need these specific gods? Too often writers create deities the same way they design a magic system, picking broad domains like sun, water, war, and assigning powers accordingly. But gods in real-world religions weren't just elemental figureheads, they were answers. Every society grapples with the same fundamental questions. Where did we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens after we die? And once I realized that, my entire approach to world building changed. The gods a society worships aren't just characters in the lore. They emerge from that society's struggles, values, and survival needs. The ancient Egyptians didn't just randomly decide Osiris should govern the afterlife or that Isis would be a protector. Those roles came from their environment and way of life. Living in a desert where the Nile's floods determined survival, they saw death and rebirth everywhere. In the river, in crops, in the cycle of life itself. Osiris became associated with fertility and renewal, his mythology mirroring the way the Nile sustained them. Isis, a healer and mother figure, wasn't just a divine protector. She embodied the real-life role of women in ensuring survival. They were indispensable to the Egyptian worldview, shaping not only religious beliefs, but laws, traditions, and daily rituals. That's what makes a pantheon feel real, when its gods aren't just randomly assigned to broad concepts, but are woven into the fabric of the world itself. So how do you do this in your own world? Well, instead of listing deities and their powers first, start by asking what problems define this society. If your world is constantly on the brink of war, its pantheon will reflect that. Maybe there's a goddess of inevitable conflict, worshipped not because people love battle, but because they believe war is as unavoidable as the changing seasons. This is where mythology comes in. Gods don't just exist in the abstract, they have stories that justify their influence. Here's how I create a pantheon that feels like a natural extension of the world rather than a collection of deities placed on top of it. First, identify your world's fundamental struggles. What is the greatest source of fear, uncertainty, or conflict for your people? A harsh climate, war, dangerous magic? A pantheon will reflect these core concerns. Second, define the key questions your people ask. A seafaring civilization might focus on gods who control storms and guide travelers. A society built in the shadow of an ancient curse might have deities who exist solely to manage the consequences of that curse. Step 3 then is to create gods as answers to these struggles. If people live in constant fear of famine, a deity of scarcity might demand offerings to grant bounty. A war-torn empire might honor a god of justified violence whose worship determines whether a battle is righteous or doomed to fail. In step 4, tie these divine figures directly to culture. Religion isn't just belief, it's practice. Take a civilization where death is believed to be a gradual process rather than an instant event. Their priests might perform rituals of the dying for days, helping the soul transition smoothly, or in darker cases, preventing a spirit from leaving at all. Before I made this shift in my own world building, my pantheons felt detached. They existed, but they didn't matter. Now I create gods that couldn't exist anywhere else because they are born from the specific needs and fears of the people who worship them. But belief is one thing. What happens when they don't just shape culture but actively interfere in the world? Well, that's when religion stops being a philosophy and becomes an inescapable force of power. The moment you make gods real in your fantasy world, everything changes. Not just for the people living in it, but for you, the writer. Most of us are used to think about religion in terms of faith. You believe in a god or you don't. Maybe there's some debate, some doubt, some arguments about divine will. But what happens when the gods aren't just an idea? If gods walk the earth, oracles deliver direct messages, and sacred sites pulse with divine energy, then religion isn't separate from daily life. It's no longer something characters choose to engage with. It's something they have to navigate whether they like it or not. Think about it, if justice is literally handed down by a god, what happens to the legal system? If truth gods expose liars, there's no need for cross-examinations, witnesses, or legal loopholes. The concept of innocent until proven guilty disappears. Divine law is absolute, then so is divine punishment. No more bribes, no more clever defenses, just judgment, pure and inescapable. And that's just the beginning of the shift. In a world where gods visibly shape reality, power doesn't belong to the richest, the smartest, or the strongest. It belongs to the divinely favored. Rulers might need a public display of divine approval before they can claim the throne. A common farmer might wake up one morning glowing with celestial light, suddenly expected to lead an empire. Imagine the chaos that would cause, the resistance from the nobility, the scramble for political power, the desperation of those who weren't chosen. But it's not just about politics either. If divine magic influences trade, then currency might not even be gold, it might be divine favor itself. A merchant's success wouldn't just depend on smart business moves, but on whether a god approved of the deal. And what about war? If a god of conquest chooses which army is worthy of victory, then strategy takes a backseat to religious devotion. Generals would suddenly seek the favor of battle gods before a fight, or some soldiers might refuse to fight at all unless they receive a blessing of invulnerability, making warfare as much as securing divine backing as it is about tactics. But the most fascinating part of a world like this, to me, is that not everyone is going to like it. Just because the gods exist doesn't mean everyone is happy about it. If divine judgment is absolute, what happens to those who feel they've been judged unfairly? What about people who see divine intervention as rigged, favoring certain nations, certain bloodlines, or certain causes? This is where some of the most compelling characters emerge, in my opinion. A warrior who spent their life training only to be denied divine approval, while some unworthy noble gets chosen instead. In a world where gods control everything, the biggest rebels aren't fighting kings or empires. They are fighting the gods themselves. And now that you've seen how divine certainty reshapes our world, here's how you can apply it to your own fantasy setting. First, decide how visible divine influence is. Does divine power only manifest in temples and sacred sites, or does it shape everyday life? Do gods speak through visions, or do they walk among mortals? The second step then is to define the rules of divine intervention. Can a god change their mind about a ruler? Are blessings permanent, or do they fade? What happens when divine laws contradict human ones? In step 3, consider the impact on different aspects of life. How does divine judgment affect the legal system? How does divine favor alter the economy? How do people prove their devotion, and what happens if they fail? Lastly, in step 4, create room for resistance. If gods are real, so is resentment. What groups, philosophies, or underground movements push back against divine rule? Who benefits from this system and who suffers? A world where gods are real shouldn't feel like a standard fantasy setting with divine window dressing. Their presence should be inescapable, not just for the characters, but for the reader. And once you establish that, you're not just writing a fantasy world, you're building a system of power that runs deeper than kings and empires, one where faith, law, and survival are all intertwined. Now, world building can make or break your fantasy novel, but it's easy to get lost in endless details and never actually finish your story. That's why I put together the Emotional Waypoint Starter Kit, a free guide that helps you plan the most crucial moments in your novel and build a world that serves your story, not the other way around. Check out the link in the description below to grab your copy. Moving on, creating gods that feel real is only half the battle. The next step is figuring out how they shape the world's power structures, not just through divine intervention, but through the beliefs they create, the hierarchies they justify, and the social norms they enforce. Religions don't just explain the unknown, they dictate who holds power, who obeys, and who gets left behind. When you look at real-world religions, you don't just see gods of war, harvest, or death. You see gods of kingship, gods of justice, gods of fate. These aren't just figures of worship, they are tools of control. Once I started applying this idea to my world building, everything clicked for me. My pantheons weren't just a set of gods with cool powers anymore. They became the foundation of my world's social, political, and moral codes. And more importantly, they became a source of conflict. You see, a pantheon isn't just a collection of gods. It's a blueprint for how society should function. In many real-world cultures, religion wasn't separate from government. It was the government. Rulers were chosen by the gods, laws were passed down from divine decree, and questioning authority wasn't just rebellious, it was heresy. Take the Greek pantheon, for example. It was a reflection of Greek society. The gods lived in a hierarchical family led by a dominant male figure, Zeus, with gods specialized for different domains, just as Greek society divided labor among different social classes. This wasn't a coincidence. The divine order justified the mortal one. But this structure wasn't just about keeping the elite in power either, it was also about keeping the lower classes in line. If your place in society was ordained by the gods, what could you do? A peasant wasn't just poor because of bad luck, they were poor because the gods made it so. A slave wasn't enslaved because of human cruelty, they were enslaved because of fate, because of divine will. In my own fantasy world building, I stopped thinking of religion as just an extra layer on top of politics and started treating it as the core of how power works. I started asking myself, if rulers claim divine favor, what happens when someone else claims the same favor? A god grants kings the right to rule. What happens when that god disappears? If a prophecy foretells a chosen one, do the powerful try to find them or silence them? Because here's the thing, religion doesn't just enforce power, it also creates the perfect environment for rebellion. The moment a god is involved in who rules and who serves, belief becomes a weapon, and weapons can be turned against the ones who wield them. History is filled with examples of divinely ordained rulers losing their thrones when the religious tide shifted. A king who claims divine favor is secure only as long as the priests support him. The second a new prophet rises, claiming the gods demand change, that same religion can become the very thing that overthrows the status quo. You see, religious power is not static. It shifts, it evolves, it adapts, and those changes determine the fate of civilizations. Instead of making religion just another part of your setting, think about it as a foundation that holds society together or tears it apart. Here's how I integrate divine influence into my world's power structures. First, determine who controls religious doctrine. In some societies, divine law is dictated by a centralized priesthood, while in others, kings hold ultimate religious authority. When religious knowledge is hoarded, access to sacred texts or rituals becomes a tool of control, reinforcing hierarchies and limiting who can challenge authority. As step 2, establish how faith impacts daily life. In theocracies, religious observance is woven into law, requiring public acts of devotion, structured prayers, or ritualistic fasting. In contrast, some cultures treat faith as personal, allowing individuals to follow their beliefs without social consequence. The level of religious influence can determine whether leaders govern by divine right, or if temples function as centers of power that rival political institutions. From here, make sure to consider how doctrine changes over time. A religion rarely remains static, as said earlier. Gods of war may lose relevance in times of peace, while new deities emerge to reflect changing values. Or think about texts being rewritten, interpretations shifting, and once radical sects suddenly gaining influence. Now in step 4, decide whether belief is a source of unity or division. Some religions bind nations together, reinforcing cultural identity and shared values. Others splinter into factions, with different groups interpreting divine will in ways that drive political and social conflict. And lastly, in step 5, think about what happens when people stop believing. When faith sustains political power, a crisis of belief can collapse entire systems. In economies where temples control wealth, a decline in worshippers can weaken religious institutions, forcing them to adapt or fade into irrelevance. When gods require worship to maintain their influence, a loss of followers could diminish their strength, or drive them to act in desperation. But even the most carefully structured pantheon needs one more element to actually come alive, if you ask me. The most common mistake I see in fantasy pantheons is making them too consistent. Real religious systems aren't tidy packages. They are filled with contradictions, competing interpretations, and historical layers that create tension and complexity. You see, religions aren't built in a single moment. They grow, they adapt, they react to cultural shifts. A god worshipped as a merciful protector in one city might be feared as a vengeful force in another. The same creation myth might have two completely different versions, depending on who's telling the story. This kind of inconsistency isn't a flaw in world building, it's an opportunity. Instead of a single unshakable religious doctrine, imagine a world where regional variations of the same god lead to religious disputes over who worships correctly, where prophets emerge with conflicting divine visions, forcing rulers to choose sides, where ancient scripture is rediscovered, contradicting the established teachings of the priesthoods, or where gods themselves change over time, reshaped by the followers' evolving beliefs. When a pantheon has competing myths, shifting interpretations, and theological conflict, it stops feeling like a rigid backdrop and starts becoming a driver of story, character, and tension. But for these divine systems to matter in a story, they need to connect directly to the characters' internal journeys. The most compelling fantasy stories don't just situate characters in worlds with religion, they explore how characters' relationships with the divine evolve throughout their journey. Like religion itself, faith isn't static either. It's tested by hardship, reshaped by experience, and sometimes abandoned entirely. A character's arc isn't just about their external struggles, it's also about how they reconcile their beliefs or lack thereof with what they endure. Some of the most gripping character moments, in my opinion, come from the collision between faith and personal experience. The most fascinating part about that is it doesn't matter whether the gods are real. What matters is how characters interpret, challenge, or internalize what faith means to them. Just as a character's courage, morality, or purpose can evolve over time, so can their relationship with the divine. Someone who starts off clinging to doctrine might learn to question it. Someone who views gods as distant figures might come to see them as intimately connected to their life, or the opposite. You see, faith can be an anchor, it can be a weapon, it can be a source of comfort or a burden too heavy to carry. And when you weave this transformation into a character's arc, it makes their story richer, more human, and deeply personal. And here's how I approach that in stories where religion plays a crucial role. First, establish where the character starts. A character's relationship with faith isn't just what they believe, it's why they believe or don't. Before their arc can evolve, you need to know where they begin. Step 2 then is about challenging their beliefs in meaningful ways. Just like any part of a character's arc, faith grows through conflict. Maybe they pray and receive no answer when they need it most. Maybe they witness a miracle that shakes their skepticism. Or maybe they meet someone who interprets the same faith completely differently. Faith isn't just tested by suffering, it's tested by new perspectives, unanswered questions, and the slow unraveling of certainty. Step 3 is about showing how their faith or doubt transforms them. The most powerful character arcs don't just change what a character believes, they change who they are. These shifts don't have to be dramatic every time. A character doesn't need to go from atheist to zealot or vice versa. Sometimes the most compelling arcs are about understanding rather than conversion. A priest might still serve their god, but with a deeper understanding of its flaws. Or a skeptic might still doubt, but learn to respect the power of belief. When religion is woven into character arcs, it pushes characters forward, forces them to make hard choices, and challenges them in ways not much else can. At its core, faith isn't about gods, it's about people. And when you treat it that way, you create stories that resonate, challenge, and linger long after the last page is turned. But crafting a compelling pantheon is still just the start. If you want to build an entire fantasy world that actually helps you write a better story, then watch this video here next, where I'll show you the exact framework that saved me months of writing time while making my worlds and stories more captivating than ever.